It's 7 a.m. on a Monday. You haven't had your coffee yet. You open Slack and there's already a thread going. Another vendor that your company relies on has been named on a leak site overnight. You don't know whether your data is affected. You don't know which OAuth grants to revoke, which credentials to rotate, or which integrations to audit first. The tickets from last week's supplier incident are still open in the queue, and the security press is signaling that another wave of attacks are coming. That's the reality for defender teams, which are stretched thin in 2026.
Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Alexandra Moore, Manager of Threat Intelligence.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. And today we're talking about more supply chain attacks. You know, Alex, there's been a meme going around online. Every day I wake up and it seems that there's another supply chain attack. Well, I think this past week has been a glaring example of that.
Yes, supply chain attacks reported on a weekly basis. It really has been that way for a good few months now, John. We've had multiple supplier compromises landing on top of one another at completely different ends of the market. We've had Trellix, Canvas, and now another Shai-Hulud style attack. You know, one's a learning management platform with almost 9,000 customer institutions that were named on a data leak site. One's a security tool vendor with screenshots floating around of what looks like their VM hosting platform. And the third is more compromised NPM and PyPI packages pushing automatically through CI/CD pipelines. You joked about daily supply chain attacks, but it really seems like that almost is the new tempo here.
Yeah, unfortunately, it really is. And, you know, while we've covered similar attacks before, we've talked extensively about supply chain. I think there's really important lessons for defenders to learn. So the attacks are, of course, interesting in and of themselves, learning about how the attackers got in and compromised the victims. But really, for large enterprises that we work with, the danger and therefore the relevance is what comes next. You know, those phishing emails that pretend to be a trusted sender, the AWS keys that are buried in someone's support ticket, or even the ransomware that deploys at machine speed across a wide customer ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. So that whole how did the supplier get hit is interesting academically, but what happens in your environment in the days and weeks after is the conversation that the security leaders really need to be having, because that's the part that defenders can actually do something about. The incident on the supplier side, like, unfortunately, that's somebody else's incident to handle. You know, feel very sorry for all the people who are having to deal with that at Canvas and Trellix. They're going to have a busy few days. But the follow-on incident or the potential follow-on incident, you know, that's yours to handle. And honestly, I think a lot of our listeners are going to recognize themselves in that. They're going to find out about a vendor compromise via Slack, via all of these groups that are going around, and they might be thinking, gosh, I don't really have a plan for what comes next. So, John, why don't you kick us off? We've had multiple major incidents in the past couple of weeks. What actually happened with these incidents?
Yeah, so let's start off with Canvas. I think that's the biggest story out there right now. And it's really the cleanest example of an attack kill chain that we have. So ShinyHunters got into Instructure's free for teacher environment. And within it, they exploited a cross-site scripting flaw where they were able to inject JavaScript and really capture authenticated admin sessions. Once they had those sessions, they then pulled data through Canvas's own export and API features. So really, the attackers harvested credentials through a vulnerability that they were then able to use those credentials and legitimate functions within the platform to exfiltrate data.
Okay, so in a sense, they were just using the platform as it was designed. They were just using it with someone else's identity. I feel like that's a pattern that keeps coming up.
It definitely does. We've seen it time and time again. You know, and the numbers that Instructure has confirmed really give a sense of the blast radius. Something like 275 million records, 3.6 terabytes of data across approximately 9,000 educational organizations. What was included in this data set was things like usernames, emails, enrollment information, and messages, but no specific course content, submissions, no credentials. It's serious, but it definitely could have been worse. And then just yesterday, Instructure seems to have negotiated an undisclosed ransom agreement to halt the leak. So at least that part of the thread has closed.
Yeah, interesting. And that 275 million records that you mentioned, that's probably the number that's going to be in the headlines, because that's that really big number. But personally, I'm thinking about those almost 9,000 institutions that could each now be thinking about their own incident response, right? We've got every one of these institutions that is in some way paying the bill for what's just happened. They're having to notify students, families, staff. They're working through all sorts of regulatory challenges, really just absorbing the disruption of this incident here. And not to mention, there were several universities that actually took Canvas offline during exam prep. Again, feel so sorry for the students that were affected by this. It's such a stressful time. And I think this is no coincidence, really, in this modern age. You know, the blast radius, this affecting other people, it's downstream by design. You know, the threat actors have designed it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and it certainly helped put pressure on infrastructure. In this case, is having that blast radius downstream. And ultimately here, the supplier really gets the press attention, but it's important that the customers or those downstream affiliates really carry cost as well. Now let's move on to the other major story, which is going to be Trellix. And that sits at the completely different end of the market, but really tells a similar story. So the ransomware group RansomHouse claimed an intrusion starting back on April 17th. And Trellix confirmed an incident on May 1st. But what they said really matters, because they acknowledged the claim by RansomHouse, but they were clear that there's no evidence that the source code has been released or that the distribution processes were affected. So we're not making any claims about the source code being leaked.
All right. No confirmed source code leak. Got it.
Exactly. But I think what's interesting here is that the screenshots that were released by the threat actors, they appear to show access to multiple different virtual machine hosting platforms. Again, the authenticity of the screenshots and the claims is up in the air, and it's been disputed in public reporting. So we're really not getting into the claims specifically, but we're just kind of highlighting the activity that's been shared. And I think that the piece that really matters here for defenders is that it's been well documented separately that the group RansomHouse runs an automation framework that they call Mr. Agent. And it's built for hypervisor estates especially. You know, it establishes persistent C2 on the hypervisors, disables host firewalls, terminates VMs, and has the potential to run remote wipe commands. And the threat actor claimed that they had encrypted Trellix's systems, but again, that's data that can't be corroborated at this time.
All right, so lots that's up in the air and lots that's unknown there. But I guess the bigger picture here is about the speed. So if the offensive side is using a sort of automation framework, then the defensive side has to as well. And obviously, we don't know that was the case in this incident, but you know, it's a tool that the group has used before. So we've got one operator with the right framework who can potentially move through a hypervisor estate at pace. And under-resourced teams just simply can't match this in real time. And I think that's the bigger learning behind the Trellix story, regardless of how the specifics are going to shake out. And, you know, we talked about the meme for supply chain attacks being reported every day. I think we could have our own meme for every time that we talk about attackers getting faster on this podcast.
Yeah, definitely we could. Now let's layer in some context here. You know, Canvas and Trellix, they aren't isolated incidents. They're just the latest in a long line. You know, we had the original Shai-Hulud attacks through NPM last September, then the second wave of that coming in November. We also had the SalesLoft drift and Salesforce to cloud pivots that were earlier this year. We've covered all of these in earlier episodes, so I really don't want to stay too long on them, but really the pattern of these attacks matters. And again, just this week, you know, to that meme we were speaking about, there's been another so-called Mini Shai-Hulud that's spreading across Tanstack, UiPath, Mistral AI, OpenSearch, and Guardrails AI, really with over 170 NPM packages that were affected, all through the abuse of legitimate publishing workflows.
Yeah, exactly. This Mini Shai-Hulud story appeared after we'd already decided on the topic for this episode, which I think just goes to show what a timely topic this is. You know, it does feel like supply chain compromise has moved from a once a quarter event to almost a once a week event, and nobody's headcount and budget is growing automatically to match that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we've kind of now covered what has happened in the latest headlines, but let's think about what it actually means for enterprises, organizations. Alex, can you start us off there?
Of course. So 3 supplier compromises in the same month: Canvas, Trellix, and this Mini Shai-Hulud. And on the surface, they look nothing alike. You've got a web app flaw, you've got a source code repo incident, a poison package. But when you actually break down what defenders are dealing with on the back of these, the same 3 problems keep showing up across all of them. It's the fact that the incident itself isn't the damage, it's the follow-on. The downstream incident response mathematics just really doesn't add up at this point. The attackers have industrialized while the defenders mostly haven't. So let's take these one at a time. The first piece, and probably the most important one for our listeners to internalize, is that the supply compromise itself is rarely the actual incident. It's stage 1. The thing that genuinely hurts your business happens in the days and weeks afterwards, where the attacker uses what they took from your supplier to come after you and your customers. So if we think about Salesloft drift, that is the textbook example, I guess. We have attackers who got into Salesforce, then specifically searched case objects for certain strings, things like password, secret, Snowflake. And then they used what they found to pivot into victims' AWS accounts, into their Snowflake instances, into their VPNs. So the CRM incident was the front door, but the cloud environment really was the prize.
And that's really a pattern that's been across every major supply chain compromise in the last few years. Whereas Kaseya wasn't really an incident of an IT management tool, it was a delivery mechanism for ransomware to about 1,500 downstream businesses. The Snowflake customer incidents that you mentioned, they weren't really about Snowflake so much as they were about ShinyHunters using the stolen credentials to extort 165 of its customers publicly. MoveIt wasn't an incident of Progress Software. It was an incident that really cascaded down to 2,700 organizations through a vendor most of their customers didn't even know they had a relationship with. The supplier name is the headline, as we've said, but the customer environment is where the damage actually lives.
Right, exactly. So when you map out what defenders are actually trying to prevent, it isn't the upstream incident. It's the follow-on chain, the credential harvesting, the lateral movement into your cloud, the spearphishing your customers from a trusted CRM account. It's ransomware deployed at machine speed throughout a legitimate management tool. It's double extortion data theft. It's account takeover of your own customers using their stolen data. It's Trojanized software updates. And in some nation state cases, it's quiet long-term espionage that just sits in your environment for months.
Yeah, so really to kind of summarize what you're saying is that each one of these is a different kind of incident, but they all originate from the same place, that somebody else's incident is becoming your problem.
Exactly. And that's why I think the mental model has to shift to, let's call it blast radius amplification. So it's a single point of trust that becomes a single point of failure that cascades into multiple simultaneous incidents across your environment. You can't prevent the upstream incident, but your job is to make sure that when it does happen, it feels like it's almost inevitable these days, that your AWS keys aren't exposed. The contact data that they hold isn't enough to convincingly phish your customers, and the integration tokens can't be used to push software to your endpoints. So if we assume the incident upstream, then you need to be limiting what it can do downstream. So the next problem that I want to talk about is one of resources. So let's take Canvas as a great example here. One upstream incident just triggered 8,809 downstream incident responses. And I would bet that not one of those institutions got extra headcount on Monday morning to deal with this. So then if you multiply that with the harsh reality that many of those 8,000 plus security teams probably already had a work backlog before the news of the incident dropped, and now they're balancing incident response, implementing intelligence, regulator questions, and comms to students and families, all on top of whatever was already in the queue.
Yeah, and let's be honest here, when a third-party event of this scale hits on top of a normal week, teams really stop operating and start reacting. Every weekly supplier compromise just pulls the SOC further into firefighting mode, and the runway to get back to that proactive work shrinks. You add in alert fatigue and burnout on top of that, and you got a situation where analysts aren't reacting effectively, they're just absorbing the workload.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the situation where these misses are going to happen. It's the secret that doesn't get rotated, or the cached session that's still valid 2 weeks later, or the OAuth grant that nobody got around to revoking. And these are really the things that are going to lead to those follow-on attacks, just like we discussed. And then the third thing, if we think about Trellix, or more specifically that Mr. Agent tool that we think was likely used in this attack, Mr. Agent is a purpose-built automation framework for hypervisor estates. So that could lead to persistent C2 on hypervisors, as you mentioned, or it could lead to host firewall disablement, VM termination, remote wipe, lots of different consequences of that. And reports suggest that all of this can be done very quickly, which means that the attackers have really got this sort of productized tooling that they can reuse across victims, but the defenders are still often reacting manually.
Yeah, and to that point, Alex, RansomHouse isn't the only group using automation. We've said it before, but I want to remind our listeners that 80% of the ransomware groups that we saw who were recruiting on criminal forums were advertising the use of automation or AI, and it really is a key factor that drives their success. But that answer doesn't work when the attacker is automating across thousands of customer estates and you're still triaging alerts in a queue.
Exactly. The answer just isn't more analyst seats. It's the automation layer that decides which alerts will surface first, with context already attached, so that the analysts that you do have are spending their time on decisions instead of assembly work. Get the highest signal events to the top of the queue with context attached before a human ever touches them. Or, even better, get those decisions automated so that your teams can be thinking strategically, thinking about how to respond to supplier compromises that are out of their control, but which they have no choice but to react to. So, John, if supplier compromise is almost inevitable these days, and the follow-on chain is where the actual damage lives, what does proactive defense look like? That's what we're going to be getting into after the break.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Grey Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
We're back. Before the break, Alex laid out the structural problem, weekly supplier compromises, potential downstream attacks, overstretched defenders, and an industrialized adversary that's running at machine speed. So let's get into what security teams can actually do about it. Alex, given that the follow-on chain always starts from somewhere, where do defenders actually start? What's the first lever they can pull?
Yeah, I think the first thing to think about is shrinking the attack surface that the compromise can ride on. So you're not going to stop your supplier from having an incident, as we've mentioned, but you can stop the incident from finding anything useful in your environment when it does happen. So first, you want to look at aggressively auditing your OAuth grants and your API activity across your whole SaaS estate. We know that long-lived OAuth tokens with some sort of scope drift are really just pre-positioned attacker access. And this means that any token that's been granted before your last vendor compromise event could be a good candidate for revoking. Most organizations have got no inventory of what these tokens can actually do.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that keeps catching teams out. The grant gets approved during onboarding, the scope drifts as the vendor starts adding features, and nobody re-audits it. And really, by the time the supplier is in an incident, the scope that's been given is the attacker's runway.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy there. And the second piece is finding your exposed credentials and secrets before the attacker does. And I really do mean all of them, as many as you can find, like the GitHub tokens, NPM tokens, the AWS access keys, what else? Vault secrets, anything that's been left lying around in a config file or in a screenshot or in some sort of forgotten repository. You need to be doing continuous discovery across your developer and your CI/CD footprint, because this just matters so much more than a quarterly scan that everybody's been relying on. It needs to be continuous. It can't just be one-off. And we saw Mini Shai-Hulud this week, right? It made the point about as bluntly as it can be made. If you were running any of those affected packages, then you need to be rotating your credentials across GitHub, across NPM, cloud, Kubernetes, SSH. That's a new sort of hygiene baseline to think about. It's not really a worst case scenario anymore. It's just what good should look like.
Definitely is. And I'm going to layer in a third piece there that really needs rethinking, which is the CI/CD pipeline and how it actually consumes those dependency updates. I know we've covered it in previous episodes, but I think it's worth repeating here since we really keep seeing those developer compromises. But it's the single control that most teams, I also think, haven't implemented just yet. So the thing that makes CI/CD so powerful, which is the automatic building and deploying of code changes the moment that a new package version lands, is the exact same thing that attackers are riding on. Mini Shai-Hulud, the Axios incidents, the whole NPM attack wave, every one of those really works because the malicious versions hit production before the community has a chance to look at them. So the fix here really isn't stop updating, but it's stop updating instantly. A minimum 7 to 30-day delay before consuming new or updated package versions gives researchers and maintainers the window that they need to flag anomalies. In most of the cases that we've seen in these recent attacks, the malicious package versions were detected and pulled within hours, which really gives you plenty of a window with that delay to make sure that they don't get integrated into your pipeline. All right, Alex, so we've shrunk the attack surface and we've slowed down how quickly malicious updates can land in production, but the volume problem is still sitting there. Weekly supplier compromises, no new headcount, and an adversary who, as we said earlier, is running tools like Mr. Agent across hypervisor estates while defenders are still triaging tickets one by one. So where does automation and AI actually fit in on the defender side?
Well, I think it first has to fit in at the volume layer because that's where teams are bleeding hours right now. So remember the stat that you cited, the 80% of ransomware groups that we've seen recruiting on cybercriminal forums who are using automation or AI. The offensive side has already made that shift. We're seeing that time and time again. So 3 places that defenders should be putting AI to work, and none of them are exotic, are as follows. First, AI-based ticket triage. The goal here is obviously really straightforward. Get the highest priority alerts to the top of the queue with context already added and stop your analysts from drowning in false positives. When you've got one of these vendor advisories and it's dropping and your alert volume is spiking overnight, the team that's already triaging at machine speed is the team that's going to catch the real signal in that wave of alerts. The team that's still hand sorting tickets at 2 a.m. is going to be the team that misses it.
And I think that's where the headcount math that we talked about earlier actually starts to change shape. You're not adding analysts here, but you're making sure that the analysts you have are spending their time on decisions instead of the assembly work.
That's exactly it. And the second piece is AI analysis of the threat advisories themselves. So when you have a Canvas or a Trellix or a Mini Shai-Hulud advisory that drops, like someone on your team is going to have to read the full report. They're going to have to summarize it for your leadership. They're going to have to cross-check whether you use the affected technologies, pull out any IOCs for hunting, write any new detection content. And that's hours and hours of low brain work for what could be quite a senior analyst. If you use AI, you can compress almost all of that. You can create a summary for defenders, a different summary for executives, confirmation of whether the affected technology is in your environment. You can get IOCs, surface them, get them ready to hunt on. You can get recommended detections drafted. And that means that the analyst's job then becomes reviewing and approving, not doing all the research and writing from scratch. And that's the difference between really operationalizing intelligence in an hour versus doing it in 3 days.
And to that point, that window really matters, or that follow-on window, because that's where we see things like business email compromise, the cloud pivots take place, and the ransomware deployment. It's really opening up the moment that the advisory drops, and likely has even started before that as far as the threat actor activity. At the end of the day, 3 days is too slow.
It is. It really is. And then we've got the third piece, and this one ties directly back into the incomplete remediation problem that we've seen time and time again, is that automating the credential rotation itself is another great use of AI. We know that every time a vendor compromise is confirmed, you need to be quickly and consistently rotating those credentials. So we're thinking things like GitHub tokens, NPM tokens, cloud access keys, SSO sessions, what else? OAuth grants that could be tied to the affected integration. You should never really have an analyst who's the bottleneck on rotating these things, because the moment that rotation is manual, it means that it's probably also partial. Things are going to get missed, right? We're only human. Session cookies are going to stay valid. Cloud roles are going to keep working. And those are the types of gaps that the second wave of attackers are going to walk right through.
Yeah, and just to double down on that point, the reason why things get missed is because these worms affect as many developers as possible. So it's not just one-off, instances, as we've mentioned, it's consistent remediation across all the affected accounts. But to kind of round things out and to be clear, we're not saying that we're removing humans from the loop. AI is handling the containment with speed and consistency, really buying time for defenders to complete a full investigation and remediation.
Yeah, and that's a division of labor that really actually works on a sort of weekly or regular cadence, because if the offensive side is operating with almost productized automation and you're not going to be behind by a little, you're going to be behind structurally as well. So as we draw this to a close, here's what I would like to say to security leaders listening to this. The Canvas story, the Mini Shai-Hulud story, the Trellix story, incidents like this could easily affect an environment where the follow-on chain finds something that it can leverage. You could have a long-lived OAuth grant that nobody had re-audited. You could have an AWS key that's sitting in a Salesforce case object, a CI/CD pipeline that pulled a malicious package into production within minutes of it being published. None of these are exotic or unusual or outlandish. They're just the things that don't get prioritized until an incident makes them urgent. What's that saying? There's nothing like a good incident to teach you things. Don't let a good incident go to waste. But we don't want to have that. We don't want to wait till it's too late. So if I'm a security leader, the question isn't, are we auditing our suppliers harder? It should be, what would an attacker actually find in our environment if they walked through one of these gaps created by a supplier today? That's two quite different conversations with two quite different answers, I think. And the next point that I would make is about automation. So as we've mentioned, the offensive side has industrialized. We've seen Mr. Agent moving through hypervisor estates at machine speed. We've got 80% of those ransomware groups using some sort of AI or automation. And on the defender side, most of the work that's bleeding hours out of your team, ticket triage, advisory analysis, credential rotation, a lot of the time that's still being done by hand. And that's a real asymmetry. And like we said, you're not going to close that by adding analysts. You're going to close it by reallocating where the analysts that you already have are spending their time and really using AI to plug those gaps. So here's the challenge that I'm going to leave leaders with. Tomorrow morning, ask your team, how many OAuth and integration grants and things like that in our SaaS estate are older than the last vendor compromise event? Then, when the next vendor advisory drops, how much of our response is still going to be that senior analyst manually reading the report and writing the detection content from scratch? I think those are really top things to look at.
Yeah, I think those are some great call outs. Kind of bringing it home for the practitioners, though, the angle's a bit different here as they're the ones actually running the triage, the rotation, and the hunts. So the question I have for you is whether the work in front of you tomorrow is the work that actually moves the needle, or whether it's the work that just feels urgent because it's noisy. So a couple of things I want to specifically call out around that. The first, as we've talked about, is the dependency update discipline, because I think it's the biggest impact here that a lot of teams still really haven't made. Put in that minimum delay somewhere between 7 and 30 days. As we mentioned, a lot of those have been caught within hours, so it really buys your team time to make sure that they can notice those packages before they get deployed. Next, I want to talk about automation in the credential rotation process. The pattern we keep seeing is either delayed or partial remediation, analysts rotating the obvious tokens, but things like the session cookies remaining valid, cloud roles still keep working. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's the sheer volume of credentials that need to be rotated that also make this challenging. If it's a one-off, it's probably simple enough, but we're seeing every developer have their credentials compromised that's associated with these malicious packages. So manual rotation here just isn't possible. So practically tomorrow morning, look at a few places where AI can really start doing the work that your team is currently doing by hand. First is going to be your alert queue, really prioritizing those critical things that your team needs eyes on now. When the next vendor advisory drops and your alert volume spikes overnight, is what you're triaging manually going to maintain that volume, especially as these are happening week over week? And the second is going to be your advisory workflow, really the time to operationalize the intelligence that comes out of advisory rather than just saying we've seen a report, building those summaries for your defenders and your executives, confirming that your tech is actually affected, surfacing IOCs into threat hunts, and drafting your detections as they're ready for review. As you're reviewing those things, if it looks like it's going to take you 2 or 3 days of manual work to get to that point, this is a place where AI can really start compressing that into an hour. So we've discussed how the question isn't whether the next supplier compromise will land. It's whether your environment is designed to absorb it or amplify it. The defenders who decide that question early are the ones that are still standing when the cadence picks up. And right now, the cadence is only going in one direction. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. And please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcast platform of choice. And we'd really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.